May 1943, 28,000 feet above the cliffs of Le Tréport, France. The morning sky was clear, painted with high-altitude contrails and the faint shimmer of distant silver wings. Inside the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, Major Franz Stigler adjusted his oxygen mask with calm precision. He was a veteran, an ace with more than 20 confirmed kills. His breathing was steady. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. Below him, a slow formation of American P-47 Thunderbolts lumbered across the sky, heavy and loud. In his mind, they were already dead. For pilots like Stigler, the war had rules. It was a game of skill and reflexes, a contest of maneuver and courage. Since the early days over Poland and France, Luftwaffe aces had honed their instincts like predators. Dogfighting was not just combat, it was artistry. The Messerschmitt, lean and agile, danced through the air. The Focke-Wulf 190 struck like a hammer. But these American machines? They were jokes. Massive, overweight, called
Clumsy.
them milk bottles in the Luftwaffe. And with a grin beneath his mask, Stigler prepared to swat another one from the sky. It wasn't just arrogance, it was precedent. In early encounters, German pilots easily tore through the new waves of American air power. Fresh crews with barely 200 flight hours, poor radio discipline, loose formations. The Thunderbolt seemed like a machine designed by someone who had never fought a real air war. It looked like an armored tractor with wings, a flying fuel tank. And when it came into view, the Germans didn't flinch. They mocked. They underestimated. One Luftwaffe ground crewman joked that if you shot a P-47 in the tail, the bullets would take 10 seconds to reach the cockpit. Another quipped that the only thing faster than a Thunderbolt was a marching column. They laughed. They believed that the Reich still owned the sky. But this belief, so deeply ingrained in the Luftwaffe psyche, was about to meet something it wasn't prepared for. Not just a machine, not just a new tactic, but an idea. A shift in how wars were fought and lost. The Americans weren't trying to build the perfect dogfighter. They were trying to build a weapon that didn't need to dance, that could climb to 3,000 feet, escort bombers into the heart of the Reich, and return without a scratch. They didn't care if it looked pretty. They cared if it got the job done. And that idea was about to tear apart everything the Luftwaffe thought it knew about air superiority. By May 1943, the Reich was at its zenith in terms of fighter strength. Squadrons like JG-26, the famed Schlageter Wing, were still flying with confidence. They had tasted victory over Britain, over the Channel, over North Africa. Their kill scores were carved into the sides of their aircraft. Their confidence was not born from illusion. It was earned through fire. But there was something different in the air that spring. American formations were thicker. The bombers flew deeper. And those strange, massive P-47s, they weren't turning back as easily anymore. They weren't dying as fast. Pilots reported that their bullets seemed to bounce off the thick fuselages, that they could absorb hit after hit and keep flying, that even when one was hit and trailing smoke, it didn't fall. It climbed, it turned, it fought back, and then came the sound. German pilots described it as unnatural, a grinding, mechanical roar that echoed across the sky like rolling thunder. It was not the sharp crack of a ED cannon or the metallic burst of a machine gun. It was deeper, heavier. The P-47's 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns fired nearly 100 rounds per second. The streams of tracers it unleashed weren't just lines of fire, they were walls. Entire sections of Luftwaffe formations vanished in seconds, aircraft torn in half, wings shredded, flames spilling out of the sky. Stigler himself would later admit in interviews years after the war that something changed in their eyes. The fear was no longer about losing. It was about not understanding how they were losing. They had always believed that skill would triumph over mass, that a superior pilot would always outfly the enemy. But how do you outfly a machine that doesn't break? How do you beat a formation that doesn't scatter? How do you win against a system that manufactures not just planes, but pilots, fuel, and ammunition on a scale so vast that your victories become irrelevant? There was a moment, just weeks after his first encounter with the P-47, when Stigler watched as a Thunderbolt, engulfed in fire, refused to fall. The engine coughed smoke, the wings were perforated, and still it climbed, it turned, it fought. That image haunted him. It wasn't natural. It wasn't like anything they had trained for. Other German pilots began reporting the same thing. Attacks that should have ended in clean kills now resulted in the attacker limping back to base, wounded, shaken, and unsure of what just happened. The P-47 wasn't supposed to do that, and yet it did, again and again. By midsummer, the tone had changed. Briefings that once focused on tactics and routes now included warnings. Avoid prolonged dogfights with Thunderbolts. Do not engage P-47s at high altitude. Focus on bombers. Get in and get out. It was subtle at first, but to the pilots who had once viewed the sky as their playground, it was a shift that hurt. Pride gave way to caution. Swagger faded into silence. The myth of Luftwaffe dominance was cracking, not because of a single battle, not because of a new ace, but because a machine the size of a bus was rewriting the rules of air combat. And still, American factories were just getting started. If you're enjoying this forgotten piece of history, share your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing for more stories that deserve to be remembered. It looked like it should not fly. When engineers at Republic Aviation rolled the first prototype onto the tarmac in 1941, even some of the ground crews laughed. It was massive, too wide, too tall, with a front end that resembled a grain silo bolted to a pair of stubby wings. Compared to the elegant lines of the Spitfire or the sleek menace of the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the P-47 Thunderbolt looked like an accident of steel and rivets. But appearances can lie, because underneath the armored skin of this flying brute was the heartbeat of an entirely new kind of warfare. At the core of the Thunderbolt was the Pratt & Whitney RE-800 double wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder radial beast. But what truly transformed this aircraft into a monster of the skies was its turbo supercharger system. Tucked into the rear fuselage, this sophisticated mechanism compressed air at high altitude, feeding the engine with oxygen-rich breath even at 3,000 feet. The result was astonishing. While German engines choked for air above 2,000 feet, the P-47 roared. Pilots who first climbed into the cockpit were stunned by the acceleration. Not because it was lightning fast off the runway. It wasn't. But once airborne, the Thunderbolt had an uncanny ability to climb and dive at terrifying speeds. In a dive, the aircraft could reach nearly 700 kilometers per hour without breaking apart. That was unheard of at the time. German fighters like the Bf-109 would begin to flutter and lose control in high-speed descents. But the Thunderbolt, built like a locomotive, just kept going. The sheer size of the aircraft was not a flaw. It was armor. Its cockpit sat inside a bathtub of steel plating. Layers of aluminum and thick framing wrapped around the engine, the fuel system, and the pilot. Where most fighters were built to be light and agile, the P-47 was built to be alive at the end of the mission. That design philosophy became critical when facing German flak and gunfire. Countless Thunderbolts came back from missions with wings shredded, tails missing, fuel systems leaking, but with pilots still alive inside a smoking cradle of steel. Its nickname among American crews was the Jug, short for juggernaut, not elegant, but devastating. And then came the teeth. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, each gun capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. The total firepower unleashed was close to 100 bullets every second. When a Thunderbolt opened fire, it didn't shoot, it erased. Pilots described the sound not as gunfire, but as thunder, a growl that filled the air and shattered. Silence. The impact on targets was horrifying. Not just enemy fighters, but trains, trucks, tanks, and buildings. Entire locomotive engines were split in half by the concentrated hail of 50 cal fire. It wasn't uncommon for a pilot to dive at a moving train and emerge moments later with nothing left on the tracks. but twisted metal and flames. German pilots, used to seeing American aircraft scatter when approached, began to hesitate. Engaging a Thunderbolt meant getting close enough to a fortress covered in guns that never stopped spitting fire. And unlike other Allied fighters, the P-47 could take a direct cannon hit and keep flying. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer once remarked that trying to shoot down a P-47 was like trying to punch through a bank vault with a screwdriver. The aircraft was designed with range in mind, too. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into Germany, striking at the industrial heart of the Reich. That capability would later evolve into round-trip missions over Berlin and beyond. No longer were bombers alone after crossing the Rhine. The Jug was coming with them, but there was something else, something intangible. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a tool, it became a symbol. For the American pilots who flew it, it was confidence, survivability, a second chance. For the ground crews, it was a canvas of oil and sweat and bullet holes, patched and ready again by dawn. For the enemy, it became a sound in the distance they feared to hear. One German commander reportedly issued a quiet directive to his squadron: engage P-47s only when necessary. Aim for the engine. Fire and brake. Do not linger. In combat reports from 1943, Luftwaffe pilots began referencing encounters where their attacks failed to disable the aircraft. Multiple gun passes, direct hits, no effect. A pilot from JG-2 described a moment where he watched his rounds strike the fuselage of a Thunderbolt at close range, only to see it roll and return fire without hesitation. He managed to escape, barely, with smoke trailing from his own aircraft. His final note in the log was short. It simply read, "Not a fighter, a monster." And yet, the Thunderbolt was still underestimated by many high-ranking German officers. They clung to the belief that it was too heavy, too slow, too blunt, that Germany's superior training and experienced aces would neutralize the advantage. What they could not grasp was that the P-47 was never designed to match the Luftwaffe's rules. It was built to change them. The American doctrine was shifting. War was becoming industrial, predictable, scalable. The Thunderbolt was the prototype of that vision, a machine not shaped by honor or elegance, but by statistics and survivability. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to fly, shoot, and come home, and then do it again, thousands of times. In its design, the Jug carried a message that the age of the lone ace was fading, that the skies would no longer belong to the few, but to the many. And that brute force, when applied with precision and scale, would silence even the most skilled of enemies. What began as a laughingstock was quickly becoming a nightmare with wings. If you've ever heard of the Thunderbolt but never knew why it was feared even by the best pilots in the world, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this brought back to life, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The first time it happened, they thought it was a fluke. A Luftwaffe pilot had made a clean pass on a lone P-47, returning from a deep escort mission. He had the altitude, the angle, and the element of surprise. His cannon rounds struck the rear fuselage in a perfect burst. Any other Allied fighter would have gone down in flames, but the Thunderbolt didn't explode. It didn't spiral. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it banked hard to the right, fire trailing from its wingtip, and came back around. The German pilot was stunned. He emptied the rest of his ammunition, watching as tracer rounds hammered into the thick aluminum frame. The aircraft shuddered, belched smoke, and kept flying. Finally, low on fuel and shaking with disbelief, he broke off and returned to base. In his debriefing, he simply said one thing: it refused to die. What began as isolated incidents quickly evolved into a pattern. Reports flowed in from multiple Luftwaffe squadrons. Pilots who had executed textbook attacks found themselves in defensive positions within seconds. They had never seen an aircraft so unbothered by damage. There was no logic to it. The Thunderbolt wasn't just surviving, it was retaliating, and in many cases, it was winning. One of the earliest documented examples came in July 1943. when a formation of Bf-109s ambushed a group of returning P-47s low on fuel near the English Channel. The Americans were scattered, vulnerable, and technically outnumbered, but something happened that defied conventional air combat logic. Despite suffering hits from 20mm cannons, the Thunderbolts held formation, coordinated, and counterattacked with brutal discipline. One German pilot was found later, parachuted safely but shaken, mumbling repeatedly about the sound of the guns. He said it felt like the sky had cracked open. Pilots began to change their behavior. Veterans who once dove into bomber formations without hesitation now circled, hesitated, and second-guessed. Thunderbolts that trailed smoke were no longer viewed as easy kills. They were traps. One pass too close, and you might find yourself staring down 8 barrels of .50 caliber death. The P-47 turned its own damage into bait. Many Luftwaffe pilots didn't realize this until it was too late. There was a now famous case logged by a reconnaissance unit flying above Belgium. A P-47, heavily damaged with a shredded elevator and multiple holes across its wingspan, was still flying level. 2 FW-190s moved in for the kill, but before they could open fire, the Thunderbolt rolled violently to the left, exposing both wings. In a blink, the air filled with fire. One Focke-Wulf disintegrated mid-turn. The other vanished into a cloud of smoke, crashing moments later in a forest clearing. The P-47, missing chunks of its airframe, turned northwest and disappeared into the clouds. Even the ground crews were beginning to notice. At Luftwaffe airfields across occupied Europe, damaged fighters were rolling in with stories that felt impossible. Stories of bullets bouncing off fuselages, of enemy planes flying through flak bursts with impunity, of American pilots who should have bailed out but didn't. It didn't fit with what they had been taught. They had been promised that German engineering would always dominate, that discipline and precision would win over brute force. But the reality in the sky was becoming harder to ignore. The Thunderbolt was not behaving like a fighter. It was behaving like a weapon, a machine built not for air superiority in the classic sense, but for terror, for persistence, for survival at all costs. By late summer, Luftwaffe briefings began to include subtle warnings. Do not engage Thunderbolts head-on. Avoid prolonged turns. Target bombers. Conserve ammo. It was the first time that an Allied fighter was acknowledged in official documents as a high-risk threat, not just technically, psychologically. German ace Franz Gotz later recalled how even among the top pilots, whispers about the P-47's resilience became common. One pilot claimed he had fired directly into a Thunderbolt's engine and watched it continue climbing. Another recounted how a P-47 took hits from both him and his wingman, only to dive, recover, and reappear minutes later, escorting a B-17. But the most chilling accounts came from the younger pilots. Fresh recruits, many of whom had never seen real combat, were thrown into the sky against increasingly aggressive American formations. When they faced the Thunderbolt, they weren't just outgunned, they were emotionally overwhelmed. One German pilot wrote in his diary that he had locked onto a P-47 3 times and missed every shot. His hands shook uncontrollably after hearing the roar of its return fire. He landed and refused to fly the next day. The aircraft was becoming legend, not through propaganda, but through word of mouth and scars. On the American side, something very different was happening. Morale among Thunderbolt pilots was growing. Stories of miraculous survival were passed from base to base. Pilots who had crash-landed were back in the air within days, sometimes flying the same aircraft they had been shot in. The planes came back riddled with holes, but they came back. Maintenance crews began to joke that the P-47 didn't need repairs, just new paint. There was even a documented case where a pilot landed with over 300 holes in his fuselage. The engine had taken damage. The radio was out. One tire was flat, and yet he landed safely. When asked how he stayed airborne, he simply said he trusted the jug. That trust became a weapon in itself. German pilots could sense the change. The Americans were no longer just defending, they were pressing forward, flying deeper into enemy territory, escorting bombers with relentless persistence. The Luftwaffe, once masters of the ambush, found themselves reacting, scrambling, running low on experienced men and aircraft that could match the new threat. The P-47 had done more than survive. It had started to alter the tempo of the air war. And yet, at this stage, the Luftwaffe still believed they could adapt, that tactics, training, and speed would give them the edge. But what they hadn't fully grasped was that the Thunderbolt wasn't just a machine. It was a signal that the sky was no longer theirs. If this piece gave you a glimpse into the fear behind the front lines of aerial combat, take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these forgotten stories alive. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the history others have forgotten. The morning of June 26, 1943, began like any other escort mission for Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson. The air was thin at 25,000 feet, and the cockpit smelled of warm metal and oxygen. Below him, the clouds rolled in slow, white waves. Above him, the sun glared against the canopy. It should have been routine. Hold formation. Protect the bombers. Return to England. But war rarely respects routine. As Johnson scanned the horizon, he felt a sudden tremor ripple through his aircraft. At first, he assumed it was turbulence. Then, a flash of orange blossomed on his right wing. A burst of cannon fire slammed into the fuselage like a fist made of steel and fire. The entire aircraft jolted. Metal screamed. The right side of the canopy erupted into shards that sliced across his cheeks and forehead. Hot blood trickled down his face and into his mouth. He looked over his shoulder and saw the silhouette of a Focke-Wulf closing in for the kill. The German pilot had executed a perfect attack. High angle, full burst, close range. Johnson knew the rules of survival. A fighter hit that hard usually had no more than 10 seconds left in the air, but somehow the P-47 was still flying. It bucked, it shuddered, it belched smoke, and yet it obeyed his touch on the controls. The Focke-Wulf swept past him and circled back like a hawk preparing another strike. Johnson braced. He tried to tighten his harness, but his hands were shaking too violently. His radio was dead. Half of his instruments were silent. The Thunderbolt felt like a damaged animal limping through the sky. And then the second burst came. 20-millimeter rounds hammered into the tail. One shell punched through the armor plate just inches behind Johnson's seat. Another tore a hole through the control surfaces. His vision blurred from the impact. He tasted more blood. He expected the aircraft to fall apart. But when he pulled gently on the stick, the jug responded, unsteady but alive. The German ace closed in once more. This time, Johnson could see the pilot through the glass. Cool, confident, methodical. The man had killed before. The Focke-Wulf positioned itself directly behind the burning Thunderbolt. It was the last step of the kill. Johnson waited for the fire that would end him. But then, something happened. The enemy pilot hesitated, not because of mercy, but confusion. He had just fired enough ammunition to rip apart any American fighter. Yet the P-47 was still airborne. Smoke poured from the engine. The canopy was half gone. The wings were chewed to ribbons, but the jug refused to surrender. It held itself in the sky like a wounded giant, still unwilling to kneel. The German ace made one more pass. A long burst, a precise burst. The kind of shot pilots trained years to perfect. Then, as he pulled alongside Johnson, he slowed. He lifted his wings slightly, and in defied the brutality of war, he looked straight at Johnson and raised his hand. A salute, not of respect for the pilot, but awe for the machine. Johnson could barely process what he was seeing. The enemy pilot drifted away and vanished into the clouds. The sky fell quiet except for the coughing of the dying engine. The jug was bleeding oil. The temperature gauges were spiking. The controls were heavy, but the aircraft was still fighting for life. Piece by piece, Johnson coaxed it home. He lost altitude, he lost speed, but the Thunderbolt kept going. When he finally reached the English coast, the engine seized completely. The propeller locked. the cockpit filled with the smell of burnt wiring. Johnson guided the aircraft into a rough landing on its belly. Sparks flew across the field. Dirt and grass tore past the canopy. Then, silence. Ground crews rushed forward expecting to find a corpse. Instead, they found Johnson crawling out of the broken cockpit, dazed, bloodied, and alive. The POW mechanics stared at the wreck and counted the holes. More than 221 impacts. A dozen places where the skin had been ripped entirely open. Entire systems gone. And yet, the Jug had brought its pilot home. When Robert S. Johnson was asked how he survived, he answered with a simplicity that stunned everyone. "I trusted the Jug." Stories like this spread across Allied bases faster than any official report. Pilots gathered around damaged aircraft and traced the scars with their fingers. They listened to Johnson retell the moment the German ace saluted him in disbelief. They studied the battered metal and understood something that statistics alone could never prove. The P-47 was not just built to fight, it was built to endure. German intelligence intercepted testimonies about the incident and dismissed them at first as exaggeration. But soon, similar reports began to surface from their own pilots. They too had witnessed Thunderbolts surviving what should have been fatal hits. They too had seen burning P-47s refuse to fall. For the Luftwaffe, this was more than a tactical problem. It was a psychological one. The myth of invincibility that had once surrounded the German fighter arm was cracking, and in that fracture was the unmistakable outline of a machine the size of a bus that fought like a titan. Stories like Johnson's spread through both sides of the war. To the Americans, it was a tale of resilience. To the Germans, it was a warning. And each retelling made the Tide Jugs seem a little bigger, a little stronger, a little more impossible to kill. If this story caught you off guard, tell me in the comments what parts surprised you the most. And if you want to keep uncovering these forgotten chapters of history, make sure you subscribe so you can journey through the skies with us again soon. In the earliest days of the war, dogfighting was an art. Pilots maneuvered their nimble aircraft like swords in the air, turning, twisting, and baiting one another into fatal mistakes. Victory belonged to the one who outsmarted and outflew the enemy in a deadly dance above the clouds. The Germans had perfected this. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were extensions of the man inside, graceful, precise, deadly. But the P-47 did not dance. It fell from the sky like a hammer. What began as a perceived weakness, its weight, its size, its poor turning radius, became its greatest strength. The Thunderbolt could not compete in a traditional turning dogfight, and it did not try. American pilots learned quickly that trying to turn with a Bf-109 was suicide. Instead, they began to fight by different rules, the rules of energy warfare. They called it boom and zoom, climb high, dive fast, strike hard, and escape before the enemy has time to react. In this tactic, the P-47 was unmatched. Its incredible weight and powerful engine allowed it to dive at speeds that would shake most fighters apart. German pilots often found themselves watching helplessly as a Thunderbolt descended on them from above, unleashed a blinding burst of machine gun fire, and vanished back into the sky in seconds. There was no turn, no dance, just impact. The P-47 would climb to 25 or 30,000 feet, often several thousand above the enemy formations. From there, squadrons of Thunderbolts would begin their dive. At terminal velocity, their guns opened with a sound like rolling thunder. Pilots described it as a vibration in the bones, more than in the ears. A sensory shockwave. One pass, one kill. That was the goal. Stay fast, stay high, stay untouchable. Luftwaffe pilots who tried to pursue upward were left behind. Their aircraft lacked the power and the mass to follow a P-47 into a vertical climb. When they tried, their engines thinned out, their controls grew heavy, and they became targets themselves. It was a cruel reversal. For years, the Germans had dictated the terms of engagement, but now they were reacting, chasing shadows, fighting ghosts. This shift in tactics was not just effective, it was terrifying. There is a documented mission in the fall of 1943 where a group of P-47s intercepted a German formation attempting to strike Allied bombers near the French coast. The Thunderbolts waited silently above the clouds until the enemy fighters committed to their attack run. Then, as if on cue, the sky exploded. 12 P-47s fell from the heavens like meteors. The lead German pilot never saw them coming. In less than 4 minutes, 7 German fighters were destroyed. The rest broke formation and scattered in panic. The Americans did not pursue. They had completed their job and climbed away, regrouping for the next wave. It was this kind of ruthless, mechanical efficiency that began to change the way the Luftwaffe viewed the war in the air. They were no longer fighting individuals. They were fighting a system, a doctrine. One pilot, Hans Ulrich, wrote in his logbook that he felt he was not battling a man, but an algorithm. He described the attacks as surgical, impersonal, a dive, a strike, a vanish. He never saw the pilot. He only saw the flashes. The Germans attempted to counter. They flew in tighter formations. They altered their routes. They tried ambushes and bait tactics, but none of it mattered. The Thunderbolts would appear suddenly, fire with unimaginable force, and leave nothing behind but falling debris and unanswered questions. To make matters worse, the Americans flew in greater numbers with each passing month. Squadrons were expanding. Tactics were refined. Pilots were rotated and retrained constantly. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was beginning to suffer from a fatal problem: attrition. Every Thunderbolt that returned home brought back its pilot. Every German fighter that was lost took with it months, sometimes years, of training and experience. This asymmetry of survival began to show. Young, inexperienced German replacements were now facing veteran American pilots flying machines built to endure. The psychological toll was brutal. For many Luftwaffe recruits, their first engagement was their last. It was not just a war of technology, it was a war of confidence. And confidence, once lost, is nearly impossible to recover. On the American side, boom and zoom was more than a tactic. It was an identity. Pilots began to nickname their formations with titles that reflected their dominance. Skyhammers, Angels of Impact. One squadron even painted their drop tanks with black lightning bolts to mimic the strike of the gods. It was part superstition, part bravado, and part truth. Because in the split second, when a P-47 dived from the sun, screaming at over 500 miles per hour with 8 machine guns tearing into the sky, there was no time to react, no time to think. There was only the moment. And in that moment, the Luftwaffe cracked. German intelligence began intercepting frantic radio calls from their own pilots. Words like unstoppable, invincible, and ghost appeared frequently. Some commanders banned the term Thunderbolt from being used in reports altogether, hoping to suppress the growing myth. But myths are born from truth. And the truth was that the skies over Europe were no longer a place of balance. They had become a stage for a new kind of warfare, where altitude was power, speed was safety, and the first to strike was the one who lived. It was the end of the dogfight era and the rise of the thunder. Let me know in the comments what part of this transformation surprised you the most. Your perspective helps bring history back to life for others. And if you found this story worth remembering, subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the forgotten truths written in the clouds. The Luftwaffe had built its legend on precision. It was a doctrine born from necessity. Germany, landlocked and limited in raw materials, trained its pilots to be exceptional, not replaceable. Every ace was worth his weight in gold. Every aircraft was a carefully crafted instrument. The German fighter arm thrived on sharp edges, tight formations, and technical superiority. It was war as craft, war as talent. But in 1944, that approach began to collapse under the weight of something the Reich had underestimated since the first B-17 crossed the Channel: industry. While Germany was building fighters in dozens, America was building them in thousands. The numbers were not just staggering, they were historical. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts had rolled off assembly lines. Some factories produced up to 500 aircraft a month. Wings, engines, machine guns, oxygen systems, radios, tires. Every part was standardized, mass-produced, and shipped across oceans with mathematical precision. A damaged P-47 could be stripped, refitted, and flying again in days, in some cases, hours. The Republic factory in Farmingdale, New York, became a temple of repetition. Thousands of workers, many of them women, performed their tasks with machine-like rhythm: rivet, weld, inspect, move. Each station was part of a living organism, and this organism was unstoppable. For every German aircraft destroyed in combat, it might take 2 or 3 weeks to replace. For the Allies, replacements could be flown directly to forward bases, already fueled and armed. It was not just about aircraft, it was about everything. American pilots rotated through advanced training schools that produced entire classes monthly. Supply chains fed them, not just food and fuel, but spare propellers, flak vests, parachutes, and even pre-packaged field kits with engine tools and lubricants. If a Thunderbolt went down behind friendly lines, a recovery team was already trained, equipped, and ready to tow it back or strip it on the spot. The Luftwaffe could not compete with this scale. Their logistics were cracking. Fuel shortages meant that training hours were cut. New pilots flew into combat with barely 20 hours of solo time. Some had never fired their guns outside of simulation. Meanwhile, American replacements had logged over 200 hours in the cockpit before ever seeing enemy territory. The edge was gone. One German officer, in a moment of bitter honesty, called it the math of defeat, because no matter how skilled a pilot was, he could not be in 2 cockpits at once. The Luftwaffe's shrinking pool of veterans was forced to fly more missions with fewer resources. Some of the top aces of the war, men with over 100 confirmed kills, were being sent up multiple times a day, often without adequate rest or maintenance crews. They were burning their best at both ends, and they were dying. While Germany was mourning the loss of legends like Walter Nowotny and Egon Mayer, America was deploying fresh squadrons of new pilots in new Thunderbolts every week. Many of these pilots were younger than 22, but they had training, numbers, and machinery on their side. The skies no longer belonged to the most experienced. They belonged to whoever could stay in the air longer, hit harder, and return to fight again tomorrow. The Luftwaffe tried to respond with technological marvels like the Messerschmitt 262, the first operational jet fighter. But even these advanced aircraft were plagued by poor fuel quality, limited pilot training, and a bombing campaign that constantly disrupted production lines. The few that made it to the front often arrived too late, or with pilots who barely knew how to handle them. America, in contrast, did not need jets. It needed reliability. The Thunderbolt embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was not revolutionary. It was dependable, a tool that could escort, intercept, ground attack, and return fire. And it could do all of this across multiple theaters of war. When the Allies opened new fronts in Italy and later in France, Thunderbolts followed quickly, crated, reassembled, ready to fly in combat within days. Ground crews already knew the layout. Pilots already knew the flight characteristics. It was plug-and-play warfare on a scale the world had never seen. It is easy to forget now just how shocking this was to the German command structure. For decades, military strategy had been built on the assumption that superiority came from brilliance, from the right tactic, the right weapon, the right moment. But the United States introduced a new equation: volume as strategy, power as production, precision replaced by persistence. In a single mission, in 1944, over 1,000 Thunderbolts took to the air in synchronized operations across France and Germany. The roar from the engines was felt on the ground as a kind of tremor. Farmers and villagers watched the sky ripple with silver as the wave passed. There was no elegance in it, no finesse, just the cold rhythm of inevitability. And that is what broke the Luftwaffe in the end. Not a single battle, not a single pilot, but the realization that even if they won today, Tomorrow, more Thunderbolts would come, and the day after that, and the day after that, each one ready, each one built by a nation that had transformed its factories into arsenals of air. One German survivor of the JG-26 squadron recalled standing on the edge of a bombed-out airfield, watching a formation of P-47s pass overhead. He was out of fuel. His friends were gone, his aircraft in flames. He remembered thinking that he had not lost to a better pilot, or even to a better plane. He had lost to a conveyor belt. If this glimpse into the industrial heart of warfare moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these stories breathing. And if you believe history deserves to be told with depth and truth, make sure to subscribe so we can continue uncovering what others leave buried. By early 1945, the silence over German airfields had grown louder than the engines ever had. What once buzzed with the restless activity of squadrons preparing for battle was now eerily still. Rows of burned-out Messerschmitts, empty hangars, and stretches of runway pockmarked by craters told a different story. It was not a pause before the next sortie. It was the sound of something that had already ended. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was dying. Not in a blaze of glory, but in exhaustion. Their best aces were gone. Many had fallen in fiery duels high above the fields of Normandy or the forests of the Ardennes. Others were simply too tired, flying 3 or 4 missions a day, scrambling against odds they could no longer calculate. Those who survived knew the truth. The war had changed, and their world, their doctrine, their pride had not changed fast enough. Across the skies of Europe, the P-47 Thunderbolt still flew, not in small groups, but in waves. By the final months of the war, they had become the persistent roar above every railway, every convoy, every desperate German withdrawal. They no longer needed to announce themselves. The whine of the engine and the scream of the 850 caliber guns were enough. For many Wehrmacht soldiers on the ground, the sound alone triggered reflexive panic. Some dove into ditches before the Thunderbolts even appeared. They had learned to fear the thunder before it spoke. Pilots of the Luftwaffe, who once laughed at the clunky American machine, now gave it space in the air. In some cases, they avoided confrontation entirely. Intercepts were fewer, engagements more cautious, and if they did engage, they aimed to fire and flee. No one wanted to dogfight a monster that could outdive, outshoot, and outlast nearly anything they had. There is a well-documented encounter from March 1945. A young German pilot, barely 20 years old, scrambled into his Bf-109 to intercept what his commanders believed was a bomber formation approaching the outskirts of Hanover. When he arrived at altitude, what he saw was not bombers. It was a swarm of Thunderbolts, dozens, flying in disciplined groups, weaving across the sky like an industrial machine with wings. He turned, he ran, he did not even attempt to pass. Later, in a handwritten note found in his locker after the war, he wrote one line: "We could face death, but never the terrifying P-47. This was not defeat in the traditional sense. It was surrender of belief." The Thunderbolt had become something more than a plane. It was no longer just an aircraft of aluminum and oil. It was myth, it was symbol, it was the sound of the inevitable, stretched across the sky like a warning that no longer needed words. And as the Allies pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist in any meaningful way. What remained were remnants, a few pilots clinging to wreckage, a few jets with barely trained men inside, a few dreams of counteroffensives that would never come. By May of 1945, it was over. There were no more German pilots left to laugh, no more sarcastic jokes about milk bottles or flying tractors, no more passes at crippled P-47s that refused to fall, only silence. And in that silence, a lesson echoed, that wars are not always won by the fastest or the most graceful, that sometimes victory belongs to the one who shows up again and again, unrelenting, unbreakable, that in the end, the sky does not remember style. It remembers the thunder. Thank you for flying through history with me. If this story moved you, if it made you feel or think, or simply remember what so many have forgotten, please share your thoughts in the comments. You are part of keeping memory alive. And if you haven't yet, I invite you to subscribe, because the next story is already waiting for you, just one click away. It will appear right here on your screen. Until then, thank you for your time, your attention, and your heart. This was not just a tale about machines. It was about men and the sky that turned them into legends.